Hello, I'm Morgan Jorgensen, the Donor Relations and Events Manager for the Truman Library Institute. Welcome to Out of the Archives, the Marshall Plan. This is the latest installment in our series of programming commemorating the 75th anniversary of Truman's presidency. Stay tuned for more exciting events surrounding Truman's year of great decisions, 1948, including our 24th annual Wild About Harry, which you'll hear more about later. Tonight, we're joined by Mark Adams, Director of Education at the Harry S. Truman Presidential Library and Museum, who will walk us through 10 items in the Truman Library collection relating to the Marshall Plan and its lasting effect. At the conclusion of the 50-minute presentation, there will be a 10-minute Q&A session. Questions can be submitted during and immediately following the remarks via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. This is Mark's second Out of the Archives program with us, and we're delighted to have him back this evening. Mark, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Morgan, and thank you to the Truman Library Institute for the invitation to speak tonight on the 75th anniversary of the Marshall Plan, which is in fact today, April the 3rd. So it's exciting to be here. This is going to be a slightly different approach than maybe a scholarly lecture or something like that. And Morgan is very kindly going to advance the slides for me. So Morgan, if you'd like to go to our first slide. And as you'll see from my first slide, what we're going to be looking at tonight is various items from the Truman Library collection, both our archives and museum collection, and then sprinkled in along the way are some documents and materials from the National Archives and Records Administration in Washington, D.C. as well, to help supplement the presentation. So on this anniversary, it's kind of nice to see this variety of collection of items that I'm going to go through. Just as a reminder, at the Truman Library, we've got more than 16 million documents on site in our archives collection, and more than 30,000 museum objects, and approximately 100,000 photographs. And we're going to look at maybe 10 or 15 of those items tonight. So not 16 million, that would be a long presentation. And you can see some of the variety on the screen there that we'll be talking about each of these individual items along with some others as we go through the evening's presentation. I want to thank you for joining us. We've got a large amount of people coming in, which is very exciting. I appreciate you spending the time with us on a Monday to commemorate this anniversary. So Morgan, if you'd like to go to the next slide, please. And we're going to start right at the end in a way, or right on the anniversary. This is the actual document, April 3rd, 1948. We know it, of course, as the Marshall Plan, but it's the official name, the European Recovery Act. It's just 2 pages, and yet it's such a long-lasting, incredible effect on both the United States and on Europe. And this is the act itself that was passed in April of 1948. We're going to be talking through how this came about and then the impact that it had afterwards as well throughout the presentation. You might be able to make Harry Truman's signature there on the bottom of the page, approved April 3rd, 1948, and then Harry Truman's distinctive signature at the bottom there. And then there's just a quote there off to the right that you can look at. Most people know what the Marshall Plan is about, but I want to maybe try and dispel some of those myths along the way tonight. It's not just about economic aid. There's a lot more to it than that. Really, the goals of the European Recovery Act or the Marshall Plan were to stimulate European economy through financial aid. But as I mentioned, it was a lot more than that too. So it obviously wanted to also to prevent the spread of communism, to expand European industry, European agriculture, which are in ruin, even to look at the systems of government that were in place in those European countries, particularly the banking system and the currencies. All of those were under threat after World War II, which we'll be looking at. And then just trade within Europe and from Europe to the United States had fallen apart as well. So this is the act. We're going to come back to that a little bit later on, but we're just setting the stage here to look at some of the documents and materials. The interesting thing is we've said it's called the European Recovery Act, but it's named after George Marshall. You know, it's called the Marshall Plan. It's not called the Truman Plan. It's not called the Dean Acheson Plan, you know. So why is it George Marshall? So let's take a look at that first. We're going to look at, if you can, Morgan, the next slide is just a title slide for us, Harry Truman and George Marshall, and we're going to go right into the next one. So first of all, we're going to look at this relationship between President Truman and George Marshall. George Marshall is the Secretary of State at this time. He'd come in 1947, and during World War II, he was the Army Chief of Staff. You can see some of the quotes on the screen, and then the item I chose from the archives, we'll start with that. As many of you know, we have so many letters from Harry Truman to Bess Wallace Truman, more than 1,300 in our archive collection. And I've chosen just 2 or 3 of those tonight to look at. And in this particular one, and the quote is at the bottom of the 3, had a grand session with Marshall today. He's one fine man, July 10th, 1947, in a letter to Bess. So even in his letters to his wife, he's still extolling the virtues of George Marshall, which tells me a lot, looking at those types of documents. Some other quotes that you might be familiar with, he talks about Marshall as the greatest living American. I don't think you can make higher praise than that, for sure. And then in the terms of the naming of the plan, not naming it the Truman Plan, which maybe Clark Clifford and some others had maybe suggested. Here we have a quote about that too, and he says, "I've decided to give the whole thing to General Marshall. The worst Republican on the Hill can vote for it if we name it after the general." So let's think about that quote for a minute. Why is he talking about the Republicans? What is going on here? Well, of course, in 1946, in the midterm elections, the Republicans took control of both the House and the Senate. So when this legislation is proposed and finally voted on in March of 1948, both the House and the Senate, being Republican controlled, are not necessarily going to pass something that Truman is proposing. Now, I don't think I mentioned the dollar amount earlier. It's $13 billion. So it's not pocket change. It's a huge amount of money, and there's a real struggle about whether this is going to pass through a Republican-dominated Congress. So in Truman's words, he's going to give the whole thing to Marshall. The worst Republican on the Hill can vote for it if we name it after the general. So he realized his own popularity amongst the Republicans was not going to be a great selling point. So that's one element of that. We're going to come back a little bit later to how they did get that through Congress eventually. If we can go to the next one, just to show you, we're going to get to listen to George Marshall's speech here in a moment. I wanted to show you one of the major quotes from that speech that Marshall really launches the initiative in the summer before the passing. So the passing is April 3rd, 1948. In June of 1947, Marshall makes this now famous speech, the commencement address at Harvard. And you can see the quote there on the screen, which I'll make reference to here in a minute. I also want to point out the photograph on the right, some of the key people involved. And I think one of the most interesting things about the Marshall Plan, of course, it's not just George Marshall. Of course, it's Harry Truman, but there's other people involved as well. Here we see 2 of the key people, Paul Hoffman and Averell Harriman, who were both really strongly involved in all mechanisms of the Marshall Plan prior to its passing, and then really in the implementation of it. Paul Hoffman in particular, as the head of the Economic Cooperation Administration, as the administrator there, to help it along the way when the aid reaches Europe. You can see Marshall's quote. We're going to listen to some of the speech in a moment, but he talks about this disturbances in Europe. He's been in Europe. He's visited the cities. He sees the devastation, along with some of his key advisors, like George Kennan and others. They're all advising Truman. They're advising Marshall as Secretary of State. Dean Acheson has made a speech prior to this, and they're very worried about the health of the European economy, the European political system, the breakdown of society in general. They're worried about that. They're also worried, let's be honest, about the spread of communism in Europe as well. So this is a major concern. And in the middle of that paragraph, he talks about assisting into the return of normal economic health in the world. And without that, there's no political stability and no assured peace. So yes, this is economic aid, but in a way, it's also political aid as well. It's aid those democratic countries get back on a surer footing and maybe less susceptible to the spread of communism, which is going on at the same time. Just as a slight bit of context here, this is in June of 1947. In March of 1947, Truman has given his Truman Doctrine speech to Congress, and he's received $400 million in aid to Greece and Turkey by the early part of May. So this is just a month after the legislation on the Truman Doctrine. So this is part of a grander strategy of foreign policy, the idea of containment suggested by George Kennan, of containing communism, not necessarily confronting it. Truman wants to avoid World War III. So it's in a greater context of a larger foreign policy, trying to prop up Europe, so to speak, but also protect it from any spread of communism from east to west. So I believe on the next slide, if I remember correctly, we've got a clip of the audio.
And it is hard for them to comprehend the plight and consequent reactions of the long-suffering people of Europe, and the effect of those reactions on their governments in connection with our efforts to promote peace in the world. In considering the requirements for the rehabilitation of Europe, the physical loss of life, the visible destruction of cities, factories, mines, and railroads was correctly estimated. But it has become obvious during recent months that this visible destruction was probably less serious than the dislocation of the entire fabric of European economy.
Thank you, Morgan. And just leave that slide up there for a moment. This photograph to the left, this is not during the speech. This is a little bit later in the year, but there's Truman and Marshall together. So that's always nice to see. This is when Marshall is leaving to go to London for another conference. And he's over in Europe on countless occasions, working with the countries that are going to eventually receive the Marshall Plan aid. The aid is eventually going to go to 16 countries, as I mentioned, 13 billion. But what Marshall and Truman administration do, which is maybe a little different and a little more unique than some other humanitarian aid packages, is have the 16 countries that accept the aid buy into the program by them organizing themselves through an organization of European economic cooperation. And those 16 countries come together and make proposals to the United States. And then that's looked over by the United States administration, the Economic Cooperation Administration, and then they implement the program based on those proposals. So it's a really joint effort between the 16 countries and the United States. And it's not just, here's the money, they have to make proposals. The 16 countries have to work together to make that happen. So we may come back to that a little bit later on, or maybe in the Q&A as well. That's a really key part of it though, because it leads to its great success. So let's go on to the next slide, which is another letter to Bess. And it's unusual, there aren't that many letters where Harry Truman actually specifically mentions the Marshall Plan, but he does in this letter in September of 1947. So this is where the appeals to Congress are beginning at this time, and it goes on all the way into April of the following year. This is interesting too, because he really mentions the Truman Doctrine and the aid to Greece and Turkey as well. So you've got this wonderful letter from September of 1947 to Bess, and he says, we withdraw from Greece and Turkey and prepare for war. It just must not happen. And then he talks about the cost. To feed France and Italy this winter will cost 580 million. And the Marshall Plan, 16.5 billion. They actually proposed about 17 million. It ends up being about 13 billion. So it comes out a little bit less. And then he looks at what would a war cost. The 16.5 is for a 4-year period and is for peace. That's referring to the Marshall Plan. A Russian war would cost us 400 billion and untold lives, mostly civilian. So I must do what I can. I shouldn't write you this stuff, but you should know what I've been facing since Potsdam. So he's referring to the Potsdam Conference, which took place in the summer of 1945, when he met with Stalin and Churchill and trying to figure out what to do with Europe. Now, there was a lot of aid prior to the Marshall Plan, about $11 billion actually, between 1945 and 1948. But so the Marshall Plan just exceeded that by about $5 billion. But as I said, the structure was very different. We're going to get into that. Let's go on to the next slide if we could. And so what we're going to look at now is a doubtful Congress. We're going to look at how do you get this through a Republican Congress? How do you get this through, American public opinion on all of those things? So I love political cartoons, so we're going to look at a couple of those. So if we look at the first one, and then we'll use that as a kind of a way to talk about the political messaging that needed to take place to get the legislation passed. So this one is from Clifford Berryman, and in fact, he signs this and sends it to Harry Truman. And this is from the Washington Evening Star. And you see Truman there on the left with his fingers in his ears. And in front of him is agenda, special session, and foreign aid. And this cartoon, as you can see, is from November 1947. And then you see the Congressman Knudsen on the right, and he's banging the drum for tax reduction. So that's one of the arguments. Why are we spending this money for foreign countries we defeated in war, like Germany and Italy and so on? And so he's facing that pressure. Now, to go aside from the cartoon for a minute, but leave that visual up there, what the Truman administration did was they really did bring in the Republicans, in particular, Arthur Vandenberg, to help smooth the way. Vandenberg is the chairman of the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, and he works hand in hand with George Marshall. They work together throughout the whole process. And in fact, the Washington Post were quoted as saying, if Marshall was the prophet, Vandenberg has been the engineer. And I just think that's a great quote from the Washington Post at that time. Now, it's not just Vandenberg and Marshall. You've got two former secretaries of war, Henry Stimson and Robert Patterson, who go on speaking tours around the country, along with about 300 other key people in the United States. Prominent people go around the country making speeches and presentations about the Marshall Plan as they're trying to encourage Congress. They get organizations on board, such as the National Farmers Union, the Daughters of the American Revolution, League of Women Voters, American Bar Association, National Education Association, and on and on and on, to talk about the merits of the program. And then let's go to the other cartoon, and then we'll talk about Congress itself. We've got one similar cartoon after this one, I believe. And there's another one. This is from the US Senate records at the National Archives. And here you see the special session. Again, this is from 1947. And you see the special session door. And then the gentleman with the briefcase there with Congress. And then let's read each of those pieces going in. You see the chessboard at the bottom there. Quick aid to Europe, price control at home, long-range Marshall Plan, aid to China, aid to South America, and then Congress. But I didn't know you were bringing all the relatives. So there's all of these calls for different expenses in different realms of society and in different parts of the world. You see China, South America there, and actually in that late in 1947, there was even aid given to Yugoslavia, which we'll chat a bit later on when we look at one of those photographs. So again, you've got this pressure on Congress with these special sessions looking for aid. How did they get through with Congress? Well, one of the things they did was that they set up 3 different committees. We mentioned Averell Harriman earlier. Averell Harriman was in charge of one committee. He really looked at private industry and what Europe's needs were, using people from private industry, labor, economists, and so on, looking at what Europe actually needed. Secretary of Interior, Julius Krug, he had a committee that looked at US physical resources available to support such a program. And then the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, Edward Norse, studied the effects of these enlarged exports that were going to be coming out of the United States. So very thorough. The House of Representatives also had its own committee, Select Committee on Foreign Aid, led by Christian Hurler, to look at all of these issues. Along with that, you had congressmen visiting Europe itself. 214 congressional members went to Europe and visited numerous countries to see the conditions. One of those younger politicians at the time included Richard Nixon as they went over there. Some of those congressmen went to 22 different countries. The aid only went to 16. They were looking at as many different countries as they could. So that was an educational experience for those various congressmen as they really started to push this out. And then Truman himself made a direct appeal. So let's go to the next slide. And I remembered what the next slide was, so I really am proud of myself for that good segue. So in December of 1947, Truman has a special message to Congress on the Marshall Plan itself. And you can see here a couple of things I want to point out. And by the way, all of Truman's messages to Congress are all online on the Truman Library website, all the transcripts anyway, not the audio, but the transcripts of every one of his speeches during his presidency are all online on the Truman Library website. And so what I like about this is it really ties not only the economic aid, but also the political stability needed to make it a success. And so when he's talking in the beginning there about United States support of European recovery, and so they can reconstruct their economies, it's also to support their ideals of individual liberty and justice. So there's no hiding this. This is also to prevent the spread of communism. Then he, in the third paragraph of this particular extract, obviously the speech is a lot longer than this, he talks about how it's a joint effort, both the United States, the 16 European countries, and he's also saying that they're following the United Nations, which I find a little bit ironic, because one of the critics says that he didn't go through the United Nations, but here he is saying we're following the charter, which is kind of interesting. And then he takes a shot. He says, to defend free institutions against totalitarian pressures and to promote better standards of life for all their peoples. So he's warning them, you know, if this fails, what's the alternative going to look like? And he's really referring to the Soviet Union. So again, this idea that it's not just economic aid, there's also a political motivation there as well. Let's go ahead and go to the next one, if we could. And so we're back to the legislation. So this promotional push, propaganda, if you like, there's tons of hearings in January in particular. You have 30 days of hearings in the Senate, 27 days of hearings in the House, so almost 60 days of hearings in all. 1,466 pages of testimony in the Senate, more than 2,000 pages of testimony in the House. Yes, I referred to my notes for those numbers. Those are not off the tip of my tongue. I've got them right here. I got my cheat sheet for those notes. But that's an incredible amount of hearings and the witnesses that come forward testifying for it. But there's one moment, really, that helps the passage. And at the end of February 1948, as things get closer and closer to the votes that are going to take place in March, is that the Soviet Union play their hand. And they, there's a coalition government in Czechoslovakia. They had wanted Marshall Plan aid. We kind of skipped over that. I'm going to get to it a little bit later with a map I want to show you, but let's talk about it briefly. The Soviet Union had said no. The Marshall Plan aid had been offered to the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc. Stalin turns it down, breaks off negotiations. Molotov walks out of talks with the other foreign ministers. And in February of 1948, the Soviets take control of the Czechoslovakian government. That's the last thing that people necessarily expected, although George Kennan had advised Truman and Marshall and others in, I think it was November of 47, that this was very likely to happen. But it really shocked the Republicans. It shocked the general public that now Czechoslovakia was completely under the control of the Soviet Union and is this satellite state now of the Soviet Union in late February. And also rumored the leader, one of the leaders in the Czech Republic, Czechoslovakia, was also murdered or went missing at that time as well. So when it comes to the vote, that you see the legislation here that Truman signs on this anniversary, the vote in the end is not that close. In the Senate, in March of 1948, the Senate vote is 69-17. And in the House, overwhelmingly, it's 329-74. So I think that although they've done an incredible job with their campaigning in the fall and in the winter, the Soviets overplayed the hand there and really gave the Truman what he wanted. In terms of the American opinion about the Marshall Plan, back in September of 47, most people were opposed it. By the time you got to November, December, by the end of the calendar year of 1947, people were now in favor of it. So that in terms of the American people, certainly those visits by the 300 prominent Americans and the congressional delegations going abroad, and then ultimately the hearings in the Senate and the House in January really led to a shift in public opinion and possibly a shift in congressional opinion as well. So it wasn't just a case of putting that out there. There was a lot of hard work to get this passed and get Truman's signature on it in April. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide, which is our next section. And this is actually Truman signing the legislation on April 3rd, on this anniversary we're commemorating today. So there's the actual signature on the paper, which is why I love our archives so much. We have all of these things documented. Let's go ahead and move forward. And so what we're going to look at now is kind of the impact on Europe, some of the grateful messages. We're going to look at a couple that are prior to the Marshall Plan, as it's kind of a trend of gratitude that we're going to look at. And then we'll look at some of the photographs and an incredible book that I want to show you that we've just digitized and put on the Truman Library website. So let's look at the first one, which is this. This item is actually on display in the renovated museum. As you know, we've just finished a $30 million renovation of the Truman Museum last May, when we completely reopened. This is not necessarily the Marshall Plan, but it gives you a sense of gratitude from Europe related to World War II itself. And this is an urn that was sent and delivered to Harry Truman in 1946. And as you can see from the inscription there, I want to say a little more about it, is that this urn contains soil with blood of American soldiers that fought in the Battle of the Bulge in Belgium. And the urn is the case on the left. And then the case on the right is the case that encases it, is the green malachite case on the right. We're going to talk about both. So the urn itself actually is inside of the green case, but I've got photographs of it when it's taken out. This is the urn on the left. That's inside of this urn is the soil that contains the blood of American soldiers. And then this was hand delivered to President Truman in a ceremony in the summer of 1946. On the right, you see the jade case, and there's some writing on there. And I know that might not be clear via Zoom, so I was going to help you out with that. There's a fallen soldier on the silver plate at the top. And above that, I know that inscription, is hard to read. It says, "In honor of U.S. Armed Forces," and it's dated 1945. And there's an eagle and a fallen soldier there inscription. And then right below that, in raised letters on the green case there, it says, "Belgium will remember." And then on each side, and you can probably see the one at the front, you can see the letters or the words "freedom from fear." Well, you can probably guess, those of you know your history and your FDR history, particularly from FDR's 4 Freedoms speech, they have each of those 4 freedoms on each side of the case. So you can see freedom from fear there. And then, of course, the others are freedom of religion, freedom from want and freedom of speech on each side of the case. And then on the urn itself, you might be able to make out some of the places in Belgium which were involved in World War II. And those are all on these coat of arms here. And you can see Malmedy probably most notably, because that's on the top left. And I'm going to read those just out of respect for those locations. Malmedy, I don't know how to pronounce them in French or in Flemish, but Malmedy, La Roche, Saint Hubert, Houffalize, Bastogne, Valesam, Stavelot, Rochefort, and Saint Vith. And then, of course, you can see there's a wax seal and a cord wrapping that, and then the soil is inside of that case there. So a very meaningful gift that was given to Truman after World War II, delivered to him at the White House. And you can, as I mentioned, you can see that on display. The only other piece I didn't mention, and it's not really evident in the photo, but you can see some of the wood sticking out from underneath of the green case there. Beneath the case is a swastika made of wood. And the idea is that the Allies have crushed the swastika, so it sits on top of that as a symbol that it's crushed the Third Reich. So very meaningful to Truman, and you can see that on display at the Truman Museum if you come to visit. And then if we could go forward to the next photograph or image here, and this is also featured in the museum in a flip book that we have on display. And this is these are drawings that were done by Bavarian students thanking Truman for a school feeding program. As you can see the statistics on the screen there, in the first day, 240 children in the Munich area were fed, up to later in the program, 820,000 children, 350 calorie meal 5 days a week. And so what happened was a competition was held for students to thank the American government and President Truman, and 1 million students participated in this competition. That number blows my mind. It's incredible. And then the top 50 were sent to Truman, and we have all of those in our museum collection here at the Truman Library. And we have some of those on display, digitized copies on display in the museum, quite close to that Belgian urn in the Marshall Plan section of our museum. But I'm going to show you a couple here. Here's the first one. You see the skyscrapers on the right. You see the ships coming across the ocean with the planes. The goods were not dropped from the sky, but we'll let the students take artistic license. And you can see they've dated that 1947, 48. And then you see the representation of a German city or town on the left. And then we've got one more, Morgan, for us to show everybody. And here again, this time we're going the other way. So the skyscrapers are on the left, and then Europe is on the right. And then you see the various transportation represented by the student, and with the sails, and then the goods all tied up on the boats as they come across. So they're very colorful, they're beautiful. There's a whole variety. I could have chosen a lot more to show you tonight, but in cognizant of time, we just showed you a couple for tonight's program. But they're really beautiful. And if you are in the Kansas City area or planning a visit to the museum, you can see both the Belgian urn and some examples of these drawings by these Bavarian children that were the contest winners. As I said, the top 50 were sent to Truman, and we have some of those on display. So I thought those were a really neat way that showed German's children's gratitude to Truman and to the Truman administration. Okay, let's move on to show some of the other examples. And this time we're going to be looking at how did Europe benefit from this? As I mentioned, there's $13 billion in aid. So we're going to look at some examples of that. So let's look at the first one. And this is an interesting one. It kind of prompts another story in a way. And I'm looking at the time, and I think we've got time for it. This is, as you can see from the caption, natives of a Yugoslav village waiting for the first arrival from Greece to come to to Yugoslavia. Now this, this aid had come from Texas, as it mentions in the caption, of flour coming to, first of all, to Greece and Salonika in the northern part of Greece, in the northeast part of Greece, and then over to Turkey, to Yugoslavia from there. Now, when I show you a map in a moment of the Marshall Plan, Yugoslavia is not part of that aid. But in November of 1950, Truman actually does a message to Congress asking for separate aid to Yugoslavia in November of 1950. And that address is on the Truman Library website. You can read that. And you can see here it's part of a $69 million program to Yugoslavia that's suffering a drought. And here you see these expectant faces of these families waiting for this flour to come in from Texas to Greece, finally to Yugoslavia. And then as it says there, another 10,000 tons is coming the next day. This is about 6,600 tons of this flour shipment that's coming over. So kind of interesting that some of the countries that are actually not part of the Marshall Plan, as the Marshall Plan expands, you see Truman do his Point 4 program, money to other countries. There's aid to India, there's aid to Asia, and then there's, of course, aid to a European country that was not included in the Marshall Plan. And Truman makes point of saying that Tito has broken away from Stalin at this point, and so makes the argument on those grounds. Let's go ahead to the next one. Here we see a very symbolic photograph, and it helps me make a point too. So I like those types of photographs. This is from the National Archives in Washington, D.C., which of course the Truman Library is part of, the National Archives. And you can see on this tank, 1 millionth ton for France for mutual defense. And one of the points I want to try and make is that although there was an economic motive and in a way a political motive to rebuild Europe, there is going to be a military objective as well. If you think about the grander strategy for the Marshall Plan, in which, as we know, was passed in 1948, a year and a day later, you have the formation of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And that military alliance of the Western European countries is really, I would argue, a direct result of the Marshall Plan. And this photograph is just helping me make the point more than anything. But it's really a point of significance, though, because once you have that military alliance, you get more and more private investment in addition to the Marshall Plan dollars. And some historians like Ben Steele and others have argued that private enterprise, that private investment helps the Marshall Plan succeed even more, because that money eventually exceeds the Marshall Plan aid from private investment. And that private investment is only going to come when there is stability. And he argues that NATO provides that stability. The other point, too, is that it helps the French and the British in particular, who have qualms about aid going to Germany. They're worried about Germany being remilitarized again. The Marshall Plan money is given to Germany to rebuild its industry. They've done away with the Morgenthau Plan and no longer going to be an agricultural country, which was never going to work anyway. And they make Germany a reindustrialized country, very different than how they're treated after World War I. And quite naturally, the French and the British are worried about that. And so they really insist on this military alliance in case the German experiment goes bad. And so by 1949, as I mentioned, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is formed, and we see that, the prominent place that NATO has today. So a huge legacy of the Marshall Plan is NATO. But as I mentioned, that military security allows for private investment, but it also allows for the British and the French to agree to that kind of industrial recovery for Germany as well. And so there's a lot of different nuances there. And if we can go to the next one, I keep trying to advance my slides myself. So this is a book that I really want to pay credit to our audiovisual archivist, Laurie Austin at the Truman Library, that she brought my attention to this book in our archives. One thing I didn't mention at the beginning, just as some background, is that the $13 billion was not given in 1948. It was given year by year. That's deliberate. So each year, the Truman administration had to go back to Congress to get the money reauthorized. And each year, the money was slightly less and less as the program went forward, and it was going to stop in 4 years, 4.5 years' time. That's a deliberate strategy because they want to measure the accomplishments of it. Is this money being wasted? The Republicans said, the money's going down a rat hole, and some of them were opposed to it. And so they had to make reports, go back to Congress each year for appropriations. And so this is one of the things that was used to help with that. And this book is called The Marshall Plan at the Mid-Mark. So about halfway through, 2 years in. And this great photograph, this is Dean Acheson on the left, and he's presenting this book to George Marshall. But you'll see the one I have on the screen on the left, if you've got eagle eyes, this is actually Harry Truman's book. So we have Harry Truman's book in our collection. There's George Marshall's book. Averell Harriman's book is with the Library of Congress, and they have it digitized and online. But guess what? In the last week, the Truman Library has digitized this book, and you can see the whole thing online on our Marshall Plan pages. So we're going to look at some of the interior pages of this astonishing book. It's more of a photo album than anything, but it shows the accomplishments of the Marshall Plan. And on the first page, though, as we go to that, Morgan, is we're going to look at some of the statistics. Now, again, this is about 2 years in, and it's going to be very pro-Marshall Plan. So, take that with a grain of salt if you like, but there's no doubt that the accomplishments of the Marshall Plan, and you see some of the things that they champion here. Coal production is up 17%, steel production is up 52%, electric power 21%, cement 58%, and so on. And then it talks about grain and sugar and meat and milk and fat and oils at the end as well. So this astonishing book shows photographs that I want to share with you, just 2 or 3, but there's a couple that mention Missouri, so I have to show them, right? Harry Truman would be proud of those. And I think that's probably why they're in there, to be honest. So let's go to the next slide. First of all is our map that I promised earlier. This map is in the book, and this shows the 16 countries that received the aid. We talked earlier about the Eastern Bloc and the Soviet Union. It was offered to them, but I think, honestly, I think that the Truman administration and George Marshall and others realized that the Soviets would probably turn it down, and they did. And then you see Yugoslavia there. If you don't know your map, it's right across from Italy, across the Adriatic. It's blanked out in white. Yugoslavia did not receive aid. You see Greece to the south, and then Turkey to the south. Those countries did. You also see Spain did not receive any aid, and that's because of General Franco. But you see the other countries there featured in this map. And way to the north there, you'll also see Iceland is included. And we can talk about the different percentages of aid later in the Q&A if you would like. Let's go to the next page. I'm anticipating my photographs. Okay, so here's one in the center is the one I wanted to show you. And this is, you can see this is from the interior of the book. You see the gold on the margins. And then you've got photographs from different countries in Europe. So from Manchester, England, dock workers unloading a US ship. And then Higginsville, Missouri. I like the caption, flour from Higginsville, Missouri goes down the hatch in Greece. And then you see the boy there eating the bread. And then you see a photograph at the top of a family home, somebody moving in Copenhagen. We haven't talked much about housing, but in Europe, there was a great house building program due to the Marshall Plan. We see a weaver there in France, and although the caption's cut off on the bottom right, that's an architect working on plans in the Netherlands. I want to make a point about Manchester because I'm from Liverpool, England. Manchester is about 30 miles away. Manchester is not a port. And here we are, dock workers unloading a United States ship. That's not a mistake. There's a huge canal that runs from the Irish Sea, from Liverpool to Manchester. It's about 30 miles. And it's the canal, you think of a canal with barges. Canals are large enough in this part of the United Kingdom to transport a heavy United States ship. So it goes all the way through the canal to Manchester where it's unloaded, which is an incredible to me that, you know, we have this photograph. Then another one I'd like to show you, if you can go to the next slide, and this is my favorite. And I'm going to pause on this one for a moment because we have a Missouri mule, which I know Truman would be proud of, and it's also a farmer. And Truman, of course, was a farmer for 11 years. And this, to me, I'll pause for a minute, but this, to me, symbolizes the Marshall Plan, because this is a Missouri mule on the right and a Greek myrrh on the left, and it's the cooperation of the European country, in this case, Greece, and then an American mule, a Missouri mule, with the Greek farmer, helping plow the field to get the economy going again, to get agricultural going again. It wasn't just about industrial development, it was also agricultural development. And so here you see the two animals working in consort, collaborating and cooperating to get the economy in Europe back on its feet. Just an astonishing photograph. And the fact that it's a Missouri mule, I think, was chosen deliberately to show President Truman. But I think it really does symbolize the Marshall Plan in one photograph. So thank you for pausing on that one, Morgan. Let's go on to the next. We're keeping track of time. We're going to get there in 3 minutes. This is just a before and after photograph of a metalworks program in Belgium, showing the destruction on the left and the recovery on the right, exactly what the Marshall Plan aid was designed for. Let's go and move on. We're going to go through these last couple a little quickly. We just got 2 photographs left, I believe. The European Recovery Program, as it's known, you can see on the front of this building in Venice, they even had exhibits about the European Recovery Program. They had poster contests that the Marshall Foundation has, all of these posters that were designed to promote the Marshall Plan all across Europe. And this is the exterior of the building. And on our next photograph, you'll see the interior where we have an exhibit about the Marshall Plan. And so you can see the flour sacks on the left there, and then the exhibit in the background, just showing how the Europeans were educating the public about the kind of aid that was coming in from the United States and how the 16 countries were cooperating. So let's go ahead and go on to the next slide. We're going to finish with a conclusion. So let's go to that, Morgan. Thank you. So I just wanted to wrap up, and then we'll have 10 minutes for Q&A. I got 2 minutes to do that. Obviously, just the bullet points here on the right, the idea that American isolationism is over. You know, there's no doubt about that. The containment policy put forward by George Kennan is really in play. They're now containing communism, but they're also rebuilding their enemy, like the Germans, the Italians, the Turks. Marshall Plan, of course, has been recognized as a great humanitarian effort, but of course, the political and the military aspects of it should not be ignored either. Of course, foreign aid has been legitimized since then, and we now have a US aid program in place ever since. Couple of other things on the left side, just to point out, certainly I mentioned NATO earlier, the formation of NATO in 1949, and then this idea of these 16 European countries coming together, working together. First of all, they came together in unity over steel, and then ultimately the common market, and eventually today's European Union is absolutely a byproduct of the Marshall Plan. So the Marshall Plan is a great legacy for free trade in Europe, for European cooperation, along with trade back and forth, of course, between the United States and Europe as well. So with those conclusions, I will pause and we will do the Q&A. And there's my email. If you have questions you don't have time for, you can shoot me an email, or I think we're recording this. So if you're seeing the recording, there's my email address that you can pose any questions, and I'll just pass them on to our archivists at the Truman Library. But in the meantime, Morgan, I think we're ready for the Q&A.
Oh,
Right on time. Look at that.
Perfect timing, Mark. Thank you for that thought-provoking presentation. If you have a question and haven't added it to the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, please go ahead and do so now. You can also like a question that's already been submitted that you would like to see answered. We have a lot of great questions in here, so we will dive right in. The first one, Mark, comes from Frank, and it asks, was the 13 billion a loan to the countries or a grant? Were any of the monies repaid?
Great question. They were actually mostly grants, not loans. There was a small amount repaid, but it was primarily grants. The problem of the economy in Europe, they did not want to put countries into even more debt. So actually, more than 90% of the money was actually grants. I meant to mention that earlier, so I'm really glad you asked the question.
Excellent. All right, our next question comes from David. And David asks, did Henry Wallace support the Marshall Plan? And if not, why not?
No, he didn't. He thought right until the 1940 election, when he ran against Truman, that the Truman administration should have been friendlier towards the Soviet Union and felt like it was an attack on the Soviets. And so he did not support the Marshall Plan.
All right. Our next question comes from Steve, who says, you said that European countries had to submit proposals. Were these pretty much accepted, or was there some modification to the original proposals?
So initially, that was difficult. One, the European countries were not necessarily getting along. And then two, the United States wanted to avoid a laundry list of programs. And so what they did was the United States administration under Paul Hoffman put, how the best way to describe this, like parameters in place that the proposals needed to meet, which kind of offset those kind of laundry list types of programs. So it was a little rocky at first, particularly as they had to actually make a plan by the early part of the fall of 1947. They actually had to put their plan forward, even before the legislation had been passed. So they were really working on that through the summer, July, August, September of 1947, where they finally submitted a plan.
All right, we'll go to our next question from John. So in the first letter to Bess that you showed, Harry used the term demo-publicans.
He did.
Can you define that for us?
Well, I think what he's talking about there is, it's pretty obvious, I think, but it's those right-leaning Republicans, right? You kind of hear the opposite today, with rhinos, I think is the term used, with Republicans in name only, right? So it's similar to that. So I'm glad you spotted that cursive writing in the letter. Proud of you for that. Kudos. But yeah, it's those Democrats in the party that are leaning more towards Republicans and right-leaning and maybe voting against Truman on certain occasions. Well spotted.
All right, our next question comes from Claire. Had James Byrne played a role in developing the Marshall Plan before he was replaced as Secretary of State that you know of?
Not that I'm aware of. More the information is coming from people that people may not know about, like Will Clayton, and we mentioned George Kennan and Dean Acheson, those folks behind the scenes, really, more than Burns. Yeah, in my opinion, people could certainly find evidence against that. I'd love to see it.
Excellent. All right, our next question comes from Derek. Is there any information of the student reaction at Harvard? I've always found this a strange format to introduce the Marshall Plan.
Yeah, and in fact, Dean Acheson thought it was a terrible idea to do this at a commencement address. The people don't pay attention to that, he said. I've not found any reaction from students. I think the strongest, most visceral reaction, positive reaction, I should use that adjective instead, most positive reaction immediately was from the United Kingdom. Their foreign minister, Bevan, jumped on it right away and was immediately in contact to say they wanted to be part of it. Which is a bit of a challenge of Truman, actually, because I'm British myself, I'm a little bit more aware of this, but it was a new British Labour government in 1945, and then nationalizing the health industry, nationalizing the rail industry, and that made a lot of people in the United States uncomfortable that were doing business with what was essentially teamed as a socialist government. So it was kind of an interesting dilemma for the State Department in particular, dealing with this new type of government in the United Kingdom at that time.
All right, we've got time for a couple more questions here. The next one comes from Rita, who asks, was the Berlin airlift part of the Marshall Plan?
It wasn't, but it comes right after it, right? So you've got this legislation, and it's probably a program coming up through the Truman Library Institute, I'm sure. But they had the legislation passed in April the 3rd, as you know, the date today. But then the Berlin blockade, that blockade takes place in June. So there's separate aid. The Berlin airlift and those measures obviously cost lots of dollars as well. I don't have that number in particular in front of me right now, but it was a separate package. And in fact, a lot of the German aid was separate because they did receive aid, but they don't become West Germany until 1949. So it's still those 4 zones, including the Soviet zone, until it's separated off there in June of 1948 by Stalin. So those 3 Western zones continue to receive aid separately. And in fact, the US takes on most of the German debt. That's one of the things that the French wanted, the reparations and the money they were owed. And the Americans said, no, we've taken control of their debt. I think in the end, about a third of the German debt had to be paid off, but everything else was wiped out by the United States government. And I might have that percentage slightly wrong, but it's something like that. They wiped out most of it.
All right, our next question comes from Mary Ann, and she asks, since he had a lot of success in doing this type of work, I'm wondering if Herbert Hoover was contacted about this.
Herbert Hoover was involved. Yes, he was. And I should have included Herbert Hoover in my presentation. He went over to Europe to inspect the countries ahead of those congressmen that I mentioned. He's obviously been involved in Belgian relief earlier in his career in World War I. And he was really approached by Truman himself to go and inspect Europe and to give reports back. And a lot of the Marshall Plan was based on some of the findings that Hoover made. And I'm really glad, Marianne, that you brought that up, because that was an oversight on my part.
All right, I'd like to end on this question, and apologies to John who asked it. I'm going to kind of expand on it here. It's a good question, and a particular Truman quote comes to mind, for me at least. So John asks, how much credit is given to Marshall for the success of the program? And I wonder if you could just talk about the legacy of this program and how history remembers both Marshall and Truman's roles in it.
Yeah, that's a really great question, and it is a good one to finish on. I can't remember who made the quote. It might have been Truman himself, I'm not sure, but naming it after Marshall, we talked a little bit about earlier. And somebody said if it was a success, then people are going to applaud Marshall. And if it's a failure, they're going to blame Truman. And I think that's very insightful, because no matter what happened, if it didn't work out, Truman was going to be on the hook, not Marshall. So that's interesting. In terms of the legacy, we talked some about that at the end with the last slide. But to me, I think it was Cabot Lodge who wrote a letter to, I think it was to Vandenberg, that we're not going to see this the European recovery is going to take 25 to 50 years. And then you see 50 years down the road, approximately, in 1989, the Berlin Wall comes down and Germany's reunified. And that's kind of the ultimate legacy of the Marshall Plan. And so certainly those types of the political stability that was given to Western Europe in particular, those 16 nations, but others too that are next to it and receiving aid as well, ultimately, like Yugoslavia. The growth of European unity and the push towards European currency, which took a long time, but the Marshall Plan is certainly the forerunner of that, because it really encouraged European cooperation. And then just the trade, the free trade within those countries that we see through the European Union today. So NATO, European Union, we think about the rebuilding of Europe and those things. And then some of those funds still exist. That's the part that's not really known. Some of those funds still exist because they had to be matched dollar for dollar. And those dollars went into funds in those individual treasuries to fund their own projects. So they were not paid back. So when they got, $1,000, say, then you had to match that $1,000, but then that went into the treasury of each individual government. So that money was then stored up, gained interest, And some of those monies are still existing today. One of the most notable uses of that money, in my opinion, is in 1989 and after the German reunification of 1990, is that West Germany funneled that money into East Germany to rebuild East Germany, which had been neglected for so long. And that's part of the Marshall Plan funds. But as Cabot Lodge said, 50 years later. So it's just an incredible legacy. The economists were very wise in the way they made those financial arrangements. They closed the dollar gap and all of those economic frailties that Europe faced. So the organization, both from an economic, political, and through NATO military alliances, ensured its success, and really why it's unique, and I don't think it can really be replicated.
Absolutely. There's a particular Truman quote we're fond of over here that says, "It's amazing what you can accomplish when you don't care who gets the credit." It is a rare point of view for a man in Truman's position, and one of the reasons we are so fond of him. Well, thank you all for joining us today, and special thanks to Mark for these incredible sharing these incredible artifacts with us tonight. Just got some wrap up business here. This year's Wild About Harry Gala will be on April 20th at the Mulebach Hotel. Join us for an unforgettable evening honoring Harry S. Truman and raising funds for his presidential library. This year's event features famed presidential historian Doris Kearns Goodwin and Truman Legacy of Leadership Award honoree Admiral Michelle Howard. Whether you love history, love Harry, or just love a great party, you won't want to miss it. To purchase these tickets or find more information about this exciting event, please visit our website, trumanlibraryinstitute.org. And don't forget, tickets are on sale now to visit the all-new Truman Library. As always, members enjoy the benefit of free year-round access to the museum. To become a member or purchase your tickets, visit trumanlibraryinstitute.org. Special thanks again to Mark Adams for joining us tonight, and thank you all for tuning in to support President Truman's legacy. Good night, everyone.